Pisces, like on steroids, like so much Pisces that he's drowning, and he's got COVID, and he's in Scotland for the Edinburgh Festival because that's the family's there. Hi, Francis.
Talking about Cameron, I presume.
Yeah, Cameron. He created COVID, you know, so he didn't have to like go out and engage with the public and be social. He loves it. He's like in a cave ordering takeout. With his sister out doing everything alone, going to concerts, going to improv, going to festival things. Yeah.
That sounds like Piscean words to me.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. So he's and he has no symptoms, but you know, he's worried about everyone, the public health, even though there's like thousands of people who obviously don't care because they're not masked and they're in a public, like one of the biggest arts festivals in the world, and they don't care. But he's decided he's going to protect everyone's public health and
service to humanity.
Yeah, service to
We're
humanity.
the saviors.
Yep, exactly.
We are the saviors, people. I always laugh about the Jesus story. Obviously, like greatest story ever told. Brilliant when they discovered the word savior, wash away your sins, victim, martyr. I mean, it's a genius story, and it's Neptune. It's all Neptune. Now that we're in the age of Aquarius, we talked about Uranus last week, but all of us were born in the age of Pisces. So this is obviously the thematic, and we can see this as a psychology. Neptune rules psychology. So as psychology has evolved, boundaries, codependence, the love bombing, the language around gaslighting, around psychology, narcissism that has entered the mainstream is all age of Pisces words. Now we're moving into nervous system and trauma and energy, and because it's an age of Aquarius sort of psychology. So Neptune brings us to our last archetype, and a very important one that it drowns the chart, literally. The symbolism is that of drowning the chart. So let's start with the glyph. Hold on. Where am I? Here. Can you guys see that? No. Let me share the screen. So this is the glyph, and it's the trident of Poseidon. So when Saturn is dethroned and Jupiter takes over the heavens, he gives the underworld to Pluto, and he gives the oceans to Neptune or Poseidon. So the trident is the control of the waters. It's the control. In my theory, I talk about the toxic waters when we're incarnating moment of conception. You get your thoughts, and then your emotional sort of manipulation and the way that you move in the world is all learned in the womb. And this is how we manage and maneuver and move in the world. So keywords for Pisces: emotional, illusion, vague, no boundaries, codependent, manipulative, covert, under the radar. You could see that it's just these subtle influences that pervade and sort of rock a foundation of a relationship or of a person. Worthlessness. There's no real grounding. It's all like the muddy waters of the ocean. So Poseidon does not come out very often. He just kind of hangs out in the bottom of the ocean. It's the 12th house. It is the depths of the subconscious and the unconscious. It is things we do not have access to. It's things that we are nebulous to. It is things that we are confused by. All of this in a person's energy field in their chart, those are the words they're going to use. So you'll hear the archetype very vividly. It's very alive in our world. And so Poseidon just hangs out at the bottom of the ocean. However, when he does come out, he makes a real hot mess. And one of the things you'll see throughout mythology are deluge myths. So myths that are water drowning. So for instance, Noah's Ark, that's a deluge myth. And the deluge myth is, in this particular case, wipe out all of humanity, only the quote unquote good survive. The ark stops, the dove comes back a couple times, the rainbow is a sign of hope, and a new sort of existence starts fresh from the good crops or the good people left. So the core of this archetype is about spiritual cleansing, spiritual renewal. We don't use it that way. We use it as a very, very self-destructive water, addictions, a lack of boundaries, muddy waters, codependence, drugs, anything to be enmeshment. And you'll see in the Hercules mythology, the intention of the archetype at a high consciousness is, if you are doing this as sort of a service to humanity, or not in lieu of self, but spiritual renewal and a spiritual renewal of your own life, a day in and day out sort of spiritual cleansing, where you purify your impure thoughts, or you look and see what you've put out into the world, and you're responsible for what you put out there. So what happens is that Poseidon will come out, or the deluge myth will come out, when we get to a point in life that we need a severe cleansing, and it feels like everything is drowning, or there's so much confusion. Those are attempts at times. So let's think of like an addiction, schizophrenia, a mental health disorder, these large onset Neptunian sort of illnesses or mental health disorders. And we end up, let's say, in therapy. So the symbol here is actually of psychology. And you end up in therapy, and what do you learn in therapy? Your needs, your boundaries, all of the Saturnian language, which is right here. So these work very closely together. Wherever you have Neptune, you need to impart Saturn wisdom. Where you have Saturn, you need to impart some Neptunian wisdom, not to drown the boundaries, but to soften and be flexible. With Neptune, you need to impart some Saturn boundaries and have some at least basic structure. So these archetypes work very closely. So Poseidon was given the oceans. He's at the bottom of the ocean. We do not know it's at the bottom of the ocean. We assume there's dead bodies and a lot of buried treasure. That is the house where you have Neptune. You've got your dead bodies and you've got treasure. If you learn to excavate those bodies and you bring that to the surface and you bring light to that, rather than the confusion and the nebulousness, then indeed that turns to the gold. So that metaphor of the cave you fear to enter holds your gold. This is the bottom of the ocean. So the 12th house, Pisces, is the bottom of the ocean. And we'll look at the glyph in a second of Pisces, because that'll explain sort of these two aspects. So just some key words: imagination, idealism, vagueness, elusive. It's also representative of the universal womb. I'll talk about that in a second, as to the toxic waters theory that I have. Drugs, cults, addiction, dissolution of boundaries in that house. And this is also cusp of, so where you have Pisces on the cusp and Neptune, and of course decanads of Neptune. So you'll find all of that in your particular chart. This has to do with the numinous. It has to do with other realms. So this is the transcendent function. Like, we want to have a transcendent experience. Without a transcendent experience, without a numinous, without some spiritual inclination, doesn't matter what that is, you are not complete. Your psyche integration is incomplete. It is a part of the function of the human being is to have a transcendent function, something that we deem to be beyond us, right? So call it magic, call it mystery, call it spirit, call it guidance, call it God. It doesn't matter. This is necessary. If this is our brain map, this is a piece. So we can see the problem when this is eliminated from our belief system, when this is eliminated from the world. What it leaves us with is a lot of archetypes that are self-referential and self-focused. And there is no mystery, there is no magic, there is nothing else. We think we are the end all be all. And that's what happened in the Job story, another sort of, it's not a traditional deluge myth, but he's swallowed by Jonah, he's swallowed by the whale, he's stuck in there for 3 days, and then he's spit out and he's forced to go to Nineveh. So the concept of dissolution of boundaries is actually the ego death. And from a depth psychology perspective, it's important to know that in the house where you have Neptune, you will suffer some sort of ego death, or hopefully you do, that you dissolve the boundaries of what you think that is, so that you can now rebuild on a solid foundation. And that solid foundation includes some faith. And faith in something, in something outside of self, the concept of a higher power, whatever that is to you. So that's why Neptune is such a tricky, and I always say the Mercury and the Neptune, or the trickster and the innocent archetype, and the relationship of those two in your chart are very, very important when we do aspects, because they are not clear, because they trick you, because you think you're doing something correctly and it's all wrong, because the function of those two archetypes in our psyche are to maintain a little bit of illusion, a little bit of mystery, a little bit of fantasy, a little bit of imagination, a little bit of play, so that we can tolerate the reality of this world. So when we shatter these snow globes, and Neptune is the snow globe, schizophrenia, for instance, people can turn mad. You raise Kundalini and you go crazy because you see this. And if you don't have a transcendent function, or you don't have a veil, or you don't have a trickster, and again, they work together, an innocent archetype, to bring you back into the snow globe and say, okay, yeah, it's shattered, but I can function here because I have developed a stronger foundation, hence some faith in something, or a mystery, or some transcendence, then you can't tolerate living in the world. And that is why this is also linked to schizophrenia, spiritual emergencies, to use Groff's term. In India, they revere people that have had these sort of, madman experiences, because they understand that they've understood a reality that most of us don't have access to, although that's changing more and more now. But those people were never able to come back into the body. They were never able to kind of ground themselves, or create, the veil once more, to live in the illusory world of the earth. But we want to dissolve boundaries in the area of our chart where we have Neptune, because there's an egoic function that needs to be sort of slaughtered. So Neptune is, or not Neptune, Hephaestus, and you'll see me use these somewhat interchangeably. And again, we've got a pantheon of gods, but we're looking at archetypes. So in the Greek pantheon, Hephaestus and Ares, here and here, are brothers. And Hera loves Ares and hates Hephaestus. And Hephaestus is the only god that's thrown to the bottom of the ocean. He's kicked out of Olympus. Okay. Hephaestus also represents here Chiron, our wound. We're all kicked out of this sort of universal consciousness. Neptune is an attempt for you to reemerge with the boundaryless universal consciousness. The problem is, whether it's addiction, whether it's psychedelics, whether it's cults, whether it's codependence and sexual addiction and relationships, the lack of boundary doesn't take you to a universal consciousness. What it does is keeps you here ungrounded. So the function of those psychological illnesses or problems are to lead us to the universal consciousness, but we manage it all wrong with our psyche. And instead we use it as a negative coping to not deal with the wound, to not deal with Hephaestus having been kicked out of Olympus. So he's kicked out of Olympus and he's raised by the nymphs, and he becomes the god of the forge and the fire, and he makes all the metals. So what happens is Ares is going to marry Aphrodite, and there's a party in Olympus, and Hephaestus, very angry, very manipulative, very passive aggressive, all words for Neptune, all word for Pisces, shows up at the affair uninvited. And he brings his, I think the Nereids are the ones that raised him. He brings one of the Nereids, and he had designed her this amazing like necklace. And Hera is just like, I mean, oh my God, I need that. And he walks up and she's like, my son, my son. And he knows it's total hypocrisy. It's all BS. He wants something. She wants something from him, and she wants one of these jewels that he made. And he's like, you can have it under one condition. And she's like, name it. And he's like, I want to marry Aphrodite. So Hera says, Ares, Aphrodite is Hephaestus's now, and they get married. But what happens is that Hephaestus and Aphrodite are married, but Ares and Aphrodite are the ones getting it on. So the relationship in your chart between Neptune and Mars are the covert power and the overt power. Your covert power is your Neptune, and your overt power is your Mars, your Aries. And so part of the psychic integration is to unify these. You need some covert, you need some overt, you need some trickster, innocent Neptune, a manipulative sort of illusion in the world, and then you need to be real clear on your authenticity and your ego and your persona and all of these terms. So they're not one and done, and they're not only one. It's the integration of both. So that's one aspect of the myth. So you could see that there is a manipulation. There's a wound that I don't know how to heal with clarity. So I manipulate and I cause ways around so that I can jab you and I can poke at you and I can make slights at you. And it degrades the foundation of the person's self-worth. Where you have Neptune, you do not have self-worth. The goal is to integrate and bring boundaries and bring clarity and bring more overt sort of power mechanisms into that house so that you can stand on your own 2 feet. And the feet is the ruling organ of Pisces for that reason. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So that's one myth. So you've got deluge myths, you've got the Hephaestus Ares myth, you've got the Poseidon myth that he got the oceans. You see the symbolism in the mythology of Neptune, of water everywhere. So in spiritual philosophy, particularly shamanism, when you talk about lower earth, middle earth, and the upper world, the middle earth, which is where we live, water runs the show. So when water runs the show, there's a big problem. Emotions run the world. Emotions run the show. Where you have Neptune, you have no control over your emotions. There's an emotional, and it could be 0 to 100. It could be the withdrawal of, or it could be the drowning of someone in that house because of your emotions. So in my model, when I talk about impure thoughts and to process an impure thought. Thought is dirty, right? If we imagine it kind of like dirt. The thing that cleans away the thought is the emotion, is the water element. And we do it in a manipulative way. Emotion is manipulative. Emotion is the human currency upon how we manipulate each and every one of ourselves. So it's necessary and it's not going to go away, but when it's mismanaged, it is how the universal consciousness, like the Akashic records or the energy field, and this is demonstrated in science, that universal energy field, that transcendent function, that Neptunian transcendence that we're seeking, that God, that divine, responds to emotion. All vibrational shifts are emotional in nature. You manage your Neptune, you set boundaries around the Neptune. With Saturn, you can manage your emotions, emotional intelligence, therefore you can raise your vibration. Questions about that, because it's a really important spiritual concept in how the universal consciousness responds to what we bring into our energy field. And your Neptune is going to play a big role there. We know that this universal consciousness, the universal womb that we all come from, this big, what I call the chocolate chip cookie dough in the sky, that thing that pervades everything responds to emotion. Extreme emotion in either direction dictates your vibration. Your vibration dictates everything in your life. You're happy, if you're content, if you're joyful, if you're sad, if you're depressed, every emotion has a vibration. Your emotional intelligence and management, not manipulation of emotion, management of emotion is the characteristic factor. So when Jesus is born in a manger, and the fourth house is the family, and that's the low-level consciousness, the manger you were born into, the only way to move from a lunar consciousness of the fourth house to a solar consciousness of the fifth house is management of emotion. And the way to manage your emotion is through fire. Now we start to see the interplay of these gods, the water of Neptune, the fire of Jupiter, this earth of Saturn. And now we start to see why the elements in the chart show up as personality and psychological constructs for a person and how they live their life. Okay, so it's all interdependent. This is a cosmic play in the cosmos in our head that it reflects on our chart, but we're all with the same players. So when we talk about someone raising vibration, and I always say, right, it's the decanat. When you want to raise your vibration, the first thing is to manage your fire. By managing your fire, the fire burns the water. And it's an interesting archetype metaphor, water, because it's purification, it's cleansing, it's transcendent, it's the universal womb. And we need this, but yet we have to put boundaries on it. So it's very difficult in that part of your chart to put boundaries. The psyche doesn't understand that piece. So you might be very boundaried in everything else, very Saturnian elsewhere, but in that area, it's just a blind spot. You do not see it. Enemies that you don't know are in that house. The first house, you're your worst enemy. 12th house, you have no clue who your enemies are. 8th house, it could be the person you're having sex with or your business partner. So you start to see that there's no clarity anywhere, because it's like, well, it's supposed to be spirit, it's supposed to be divine, so I don't see the truth, I'm confused, I don't put a boundary there because I want to have no ego, and it just creates a mush pot of nonsense. Okay, so anything to do with water and mythology, these deluge myths, is all about this. So this is the archetype, and now we are moving into the age of Aquarius, but this is the archetype that has ruled the last 2,000 years. Hence religion, when we talk about a savior, one of the words of Neptune, savior, martyr, rescuer, scapegoat, we see why that story, that Christian story has to pervade at least Western consciousness because it's in us. We live it unknowingly, that you live the Jesus story. You live the Jesus story with these two archetypes, Chiron and Neptune in the chart. Any questions about that? So Jonah is swallowed by the whale, and he tells God, I'm not going to Nineveh. Those people are bad people. And he runs away in the opposite direction, and the whale swallows Jonah. And 3 days in the belly of the whale, he goes down to his knees and he realizes he is nothing. And imagine a crookedness in you, which we all have. It is in that house, if used properly, that is a very tricky archetype. This archetype is extremely tricky, okay? Imagine that to straighten out your crookedness, if you were a tree, right? Like, and straighten out the trunk, you need to dissolve fully so that the roots can grow. The roots aren't dead, but the roots can go straight. So that's a metaphor in the Jonah story. He has to dissolve fully so that he can get straight, sort of straight and narrow. And then he spit out, gone to Nineveh, he preaches to Nineveh, and he saves the land of Nineveh as God intended. In that house, there's going to be an ego dissolution. You may view it as addiction or codependent or mental health issues, or someone betrayed you, took all your money, gave you an STD, whatever it is. But the function of that story of refusal to go to Nineveh occurs in that house so that you can get straightened out, so that you can understand that you are not the end all be all, that there is something beyond you, a higher power, a transcendent function, a God, a throne, whatever you see. And you have a little bit of humility to that mystery of the world, this numinous experience that exists. And you consider that just a little bit upon all your ego. You allow this thing, this function, to move you. In our kind of world, it's the idea of a spiritual renewal or a spiritual practice. If you're doing breath work, if you're doing yoga, if you're opening the record, whatever, it's the constant reinforcement that there is something that I respond to and with and engage in that is not just me in this earthly thing. And it is something that continues beyond my earthly body dying. So we have the idea, but we don't really live it in a unified way. So it often takes a severe deluge in your life, a drowning deluge myth, for you to purify so you can remember that you respond to something higher. Questions? It's a tricky, nebulous, confusing, all worth, all worthlessness archetype. It's very difficult. And if you feel these archetypes in your life, if you really connect to an archetype and live it, you notice that it takes over you. And that's how you'll live. And if you've ever felt like confused, if you've ever been, sucker punched with some sort of new, that's a like what just happened? You're like drowning at the bottom of the ocean. You don't know which way you're going. So imagine a Pisces moon, a strong Pisces placement where you have Neptune. That's how you're going to live in that domain. So let me just speak a moment to the Pisces moon. The Pisces moon, in my personal opinion, is the most difficult, because the concept of the Pisces moon, and this is not logic, and I think, Nicole, you have a Pisces moon, if I'm not mistaken. It is not that you think that your mother is the universal mother. It's that you think the universe is your mother. Therefore, you respond from the lunar function emotionally to only the numinous and this divinity. So where is the earthly function? Where is the here now roots? It gets very confusing. Moon in Pisces is very difficult because of this. And oftentimes the mother is absolutely on a pedestal. I have many clients where the mother is the end all be all, the saint. They will describe her as a saint. I know that's not necessarily your case, but that's how it's viewed, because it's not an earthly form. This is the goddess. The goddess is my mother. Okay. Think of the cow in India. Okay. That is the moon in Pisces. The goddess is the mother. You cannot touch her. It has reign over everything. So it's a very difficult placement. And I have a sun in Pisces and a lot of placements in Pisces. It's a difficult placement. Now, are you connected? Are you psychic as hell? Do you have an imagination like no other? Of course, you don't live in the reality realms. You're like hanging out with, you know, any creature known to man or not known to man, and unicorns and elves and you know, whatever it is that you picture up in your imagination, which is all true for a Pisces placement. So that is an imagination to a Pisces or a Pisces placement or a Neptune. It is truth. There is no distinction between this world, that world, and that's the glyph of the two fish. So if a Pisces or a Pisces placement, or you have Neptune, says to you, I live in a Hallmark love affair with my husband, Neptune in the 7th placement, they live that. They are in a Hallmark movie. There is no telling that person that is not truth. And that's important. That's what makes a psychic a really good psychic. That's what makes an intuitive a really good intuitive. It shows up, there's no doubt. There's no, of course it's real what I'm feeling, what I'm seeing, what I'm smelling, what I'm tasting. So you start to see how it's so necessary, but yet it could be so scary and destructive, and you're open to forces that you don't even know exist. This archetype in certain parts of the chart, the person really requires a spiritual education. It's a scary placement to not have a spiritual education, because you don't understand how all of this works and mixes and matches, and then you become a product of, you know, it could be spiritual abuse, coercion, sexual abuse, manipulation, a lot of things. So it's a very, very scary archetype, but it is the archetype that rules the world, because we are in the Middle Earth, and the Middle Earth is ruled by water. That's the way it is. So this all starts in the pregnancy. In pregnancy, you learn one emotion. The way mom is dealing with work, the spouse, the other children, her pregnancy, her money problems, her physical ailments, doesn't matter, the story. She's sending you a signal in the womb waters that love is this vibration. This vibration has a name, and it is an emotion. That emotion is linked to the vibration that you continuously attract into your life, primarily where you have Neptune and any other Pisces placements. It cannot be eradicated. If you were to let go of that emotion, you would think you would die, because you would never have been born or you know, formed in the womb. So alcohol, food addiction, sex addiction, codependent addiction, gaslighting addiction, manipulation addiction, any addiction is a pregnancy problem, is a Neptune problem, is what I call a toxic water problem. That water is toxic. The emotion is the toxicity. The vibration linked to the emotion is the toxicity. Does that make sense? So there's also a specialness in this, because when Hephaestus goes to Hera and he knows that he's got this manipulative little thing that he can dangle in front of her, we do that depending on sign, aspects, house, and each generation, a Neptune transit lasts 14 years. So it's a 14-year. We're not going to have anybody that's Neptune in Virgo beyond. Like, we're not going to have any Neptune in Leo, Neptune in Cancer, or Gemini. Like, those are too early. I think Virgo was 1928 or 30 or something like that, in 14 years forward. Most of us are Neptune in Sag. Sharon obviously is probably Neptune in Scorpio, maybe. So it's going to be a generational 14-year story that generation lives out.
Francis, I'm in Sagittarius.
You're in
I looked it
Sagittarius?
up.
Okay. So yeah, I couldn't.
I noticed like all of our kids are Aquarius.
Yeah, all of our kids will be Neptune and Aquarius. And this generation that's being born now is all Neptune and Pisces. And I have a theory on that. All of those Neptune and Pisces babies are a product of like the yoga moms. So Western psychology, Neptune, with a Piscean Eastern philosophy in the house, but no one ever bridged the gap. I have a whole lecture on that on my YouTube channel. That's going to create a lot of mental health stuff, because they're going to want to, and I think, Jen, you told me the other day that Roman Catholicism was having a sort of resurgence. So it may not be traditional religion, but there's going to be something that's going to try to bridge these two philosophies that aren't different, but the transcendent function is different. And in the Western world, God is externalized. He's in the sky. In the Eastern world, the divine is within. And I think that generation is going to sell it and package it in a way that it can work, that both it coexist.
This is the generation that is replacing religion with systems like astrology.
Exactly. Although astrology is an Aquarius archetype, the Neptune in Aquarius, you see that.
Yeah.
That's why the relationship, because the Neptune is the transcendent function in psychology. We cannot exist without a belief in something. Our psyche cannot tolerate it. So it becomes an alcohol. It becomes a person. It becomes our marriage. But it exists in your psychology, because that pregnancy function of the snow globe, that's the metaphor of the snow globe, was created with you and mom. And that has to maintain, for you to have integrity of your psyche and tolerate the illusion of this world, there must be an addiction to something. In a healthy person, in a healthy psyche, after you've dissolved your ego and built it back up and understood all of this, now it's, oh, I'm going to serve, I'm going to have a spiritual practice, a spiritual reverence to something, and it just is part of your existence. But prior to that, and you see the same thing with people that are immersed in religion, and religion is the addiction, right? The church and all of the church functions. Religion, spirituality, very different. This is a transcendent spiritual function where the numinous, where something beyond exists in you and you have a connection to it on a regular basis. It's not something separate that you go when you have a crisis. This is part of the psychic structure for health. So astrology is going to serve a lot of that for people. Now, again, astrology can become an addiction where it simply replaces a church, a building, and now it's a set of like, oh, I have Neptune in the third and this, and let me not date that guy because he has this and that. That isn't transcendence. That is not connecting to something higher. That is just a logical, rational, intellectualization of this. These are archetypes that are alive. And if you pay attention, you know when you are dealing with a Neptune archetype, a Neptunian person, when you're dazed and confused. That is this energy that kind of is woven into all of this earthly world. That's why when people are like, I saw the truth, I had this moment, that's why in the hero's journey, when you cross the threshold is the metaphor of Neptune, the snow globe shattered. You can't unsee. You enter the extraordinary world. And the extraordinary world is a lot of darkness and a lot of shadow and a lot of muddy waters and a lot of skeletons and a lot of dead bodies. But if you don't come outside of the extraordinary world, cross the threshold back home, you get stuck in this archetype and it's going to be addiction or mental health problem or suicide. So we have to repackage ourselves back like Jonah and go and assume an earthly function. Pisces people struggle. Pisces placements struggle. Neptune in your chart will struggle with that. So it's a very easy escape route in the chart. So I have this as the ruler of my chart. I'm a Pisces. I mean, escapism, cults, all of this. You guys know my story. I mean, this archetype has been alive and well in my life. And Jen, you see that with your son. Like when you know really heavily Pisces people, it makes sense why life is just, I can't function. There's a few things I wanted to say, so I made notes so I don't. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the esoteric myth, the Hercules myth. So now Hercules is on his last labor. You see the theme of immortality in mythology a lot, namely Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is the oldest myth, and if you know how to read Gilgamesh, it's the entire astrology chart. And what happens with Gilgamesh is at the end, he's seeking the plan of immortality. And does anyone know what happens at the end? He falls asleep. So when you see immortality, when you see sleep, Wizard of Oz, what happens? She's on her way to the Wizard of Oz, and the Wicked Witch puts that sleepy snow. You fall asleep. And I'm going to use labyrinth as a negative term, not labyrinth as a spiritual terminology. You fall asleep in the labyrinth of life with this archetype. It is a labyrinth and you don't know how to get out of it. And a lot of times it's just, you give up. You don't care. You're just like, whatever, I'm an addict. This is what you just, because it is such a web we weave in this labyrinth of Neptune in our psyche that it's very difficult. So when you see those in stories of sleep, things like that, it's a sleeping of the consciousness. It's going back to not being woke, right? Not what I said last week, being woke is just the second level of consciousness, but real ignorance. You just go back to full-blown ignorance. That's how easy it is to slip where you have Neptune. You can be the most spiritual person in doing yoga, you're all this, and then all of a sudden you're like, throw this shit away. I don't give a shit. And you go right back to it because it's a labyrinth that is a constant. I have the weeds and the mangroves and where are the goggles, and it's a labyrinth of the mind. Then you unless you put Saturnian function in that house for life, you're going to be. And the other thing you can do, not in an escape way, is find a spiritual renewal system, a spiritual reverence practice. That's the other way to sort of work with this archetype. But it's very confusing and difficult. So it's his last labor, and he's told that he has to go capture the cattle of Gairon. So let me get this. So he has to go capture the cattle of Gairon. Anytime a myth has cattle, what does that refer to? Low consciousness, animal consciousness. So he's told he has to go get the cattle of Gairon. Whenever a mythology or a story or a symbol, anything, a metaphor has an animal nature, it is referring to low-level consciousness. So what he has to do is, Gairon is a three-headed monster. You see these themes repeated a lot. 3 heads. Cerberus, 3 heads. Geiron, 3 heads. Physical, emotional, mental body. If you don't tackle a problem at the physical, mental, and emotional, my TED Talk, TED, thought, emotion, desire, you do not work the problem. So, you know how they say 666, the number of the beast? 666, the number of the beast, has nothing to do with the devil. It has to do with the physical, the emotional, and the mental. And it's linked to the Virgo and the 6th house, which is the opposite sign of Pisces. So Virgo and Pisces have a lot here, the virgin birth, the number of the beast, because the physical body is where the physical, emotional, and mental bodies are. And the only antidote is the spiritual or the transcendent function. Finding a spiritual belief system, practice, something true, not ritual, just taking communion. I'm talking about true understanding, spiritual knowledge. It's the only way to defeat the beast of being human, low consciousness, animal. That's why you see a lot of 3-headed things in mythology. You don't defeat the 3 heads. You've only eliminated the physicality of the problem, not the root. So he sits in meditation because he has no clue how he's going to do this. And a chalice appears. The chalice is the symbol of the divine feminine. The chalice is the symbol of our body. This is us. So when you drink the blood of Christ, it's the body. In the Fisher King myth, which they made a movie about, there's a chalice that they have to get. In King Arthur, the chalice shows up, the golden, what do they call it?
The Grail.
The Grail, the Holy Grail. It's a chalice. It's about the purification of the body and finding the divine, AKA the transcendent, in the body, not outside of the body. So he is told to go get the cattle. The chalice shows up. The chalice is to put the cattle inside, and he has an arrow, and with one arrow, he kills all 3 heads of Geiron. You cannot work an issue, a Neptune issue, a Neptune problem, if you don't go to thought, emotion, desire, the physical, the emotional, and the mental, conception, pregnancy, birth. It doesn't work. So when people are the behavior, I didn't eat the cake, but I think about the cake, problem not solved, Neptune issue, addiction. It may not be visible to the world, but it's the labyrinth of their head. You have no peace in the first house, in the Neptune house, none, because it's constant unless you do this myth. So he shoots the arrow, the 3 heads die, he gets all the cattle, and he puts the cattle in the chalice. Any idea what that means? Putting the cattle inside the chalice. Okay, let me take you back a moment to Taurus, the Cretan bull. Hercules rode the bull from King Minos to the temple. He rode the bull of desire. This is a completely different thing. To live harmoniously, to live somewhat normal, right? Wide door, mass consciousness, you're constantly fighting with your desires. I ate too much, so I purify. I had too much sex, I go on a man cleanse. I drank too much, I smoked too much, I slept too much, right? We're in this constant 0 to 100. I'm going to fix it with 3 days of a cleanse. That's how most people live. In order to override that, that is Hercules riding the bull of desires. You don't let your desires super self-destruct you, but you also really don't have much control over them. And when the desire to eat the cake comes, you give in, you say screw it, and then you work out the next 3 days. I mean, that's most of the nonsense of the labyrinth that people live. You hear it, right? At the gym, and I drank too much and the weekend party. That's Neptune. To really master this archetype at a high level consciousness, to really understand the transcendent function in our psyche and as a universe, as what this is all about spiritually. It's about the desires being contained in the chalice. The chalice is a metaphor. Yes, it's the body, but it's the divine feminine. Where now, instead of breaking even, I ate 3 days cake, I go work out 3 days to burn it off. I had too much sex, I pull back my sex for a week and I purify. That was the myth in Truth 6 of purification, when Hercules killed Hippolyte and then purified by saving Hesione. If you're in that nonsense your whole life, you're in a total Neptune labyrinth. You've learned nothing, you have managed, not drowning, but you're like coming up for water every third day. We don't want to live like that, right? I mean, we're studying these things because we want to overcome that if possible. That's the Neptune at the high vibration, at the high consciousness. So now the cattle, the low level consciousness, the desire, the thought, emotion, desire, the physical, emotional, and mental bodies have to go inside. And your spiritual renewal, your connection to the divine, your transcendent runs the show. Then you honor desires. You have to eat, you have to have sex, you have to poop, you have to sleep, you have to do these things. But it's this that's running the show. You're not just trying to manage the desire to stay a certain weight, to stay happy in a marriage, to have a certain bank account. This is very, very, very difficult. Most people in the past, this is definitely shifting. And this is why I like some of the, I think it's Don Miguel literature when he talks about the petty tyrant, and Gurdjieff when he talks about the fourth way, that it's in the world that we're learning this. It's not about the ashram. This Neptune archetype is the ashram, is the mental institution, is the psychiatric hospital, is the monastery. So that's why you used to see the mystics or people who couldn't handle society moving to those parts of the world in exile, just like people were put away into mental institutions and ignored by their family. So this is becoming now, and we see this with the age of Aquarius, part of the everyday matrix of our language and the matrices of our fabric of our society. We'll see how this is, but this generation with Neptune and Aquarius is going to have a lot to do with that. Neptune and Pisces. The Neptune and Aries people, I think that they're going to blow this out. I think they're going to pull BS on the sticky note spirituality. That's my opinion, but that's going to be probably, I'll be dead. Because now you have Neptune and Mars. Now you have Hephaestus and Aries, and there is going to be a war in that person's psyche. When Neptune and Aries starts in a couple of years, that is going to be totally a different construct. The over and the covert, and they're going to try to find that midpoint in whatever they do in the world. So you start to see these archetypes. It's fascinating. It's really fascinating. The Neptune is just marvelous. Any questions about that? I know it's a lot of myth and stuff, but I think it's important to really understand this idea of, I dissolve boundaries because I want to be one in the womb with mom, and I want to be one in the womb with the universe. I don't know how. So I don't have boundaries. I have codependence. I have addiction that makes me feel like that, unhealthy. I have a major aha snow globe shattering moment. My life falls apart. My ego dissolves. I rebuild it on a solid foundation, the feet, the roots of the tree, the trunk is upright, and now I can bear fruit. And that is a thing in the Bible. You will know him by his fruit. That is directly related to Neptune, to the feet. The path, symbolic of the feet walking a spiritual path. So we see that myth of feet a lot too. Jesus washes the disciples' feet. St. Francis of Assisi walks barefoot in the snow building his temple. So let me take you to the glyph. Stop share. I have to end with a bang with Pisces and Neptune. Let's look at Cameron a second. Oh, you'll have to give me, what is it, March 4th?
March 4th, 98.
What time?
2:22 p.m.
That is so freaking interesting.
Oh, wow.
222. Because the number 2 is the concept of spirit and matter unified. So when you start to understand symbol and myth and metaphor and all of this, you start to realize that the time, the play, all of it makes so much sense. The message is everywhere in the person. It's not just one place. Edinburgh, right?
No, actually, Manchester, England.
Oh, Manchester. Okay. Oh, wow.
Yeah, I know, right?
So first, let's just look at the glyph for a second. The glyph are 2 fish. So Starbucks has made a very big killing on the Pisces logo. The original actually Starbucks logo, you could see the complete, they later on cut it off. But if you actually see the logo of Starbucks, it's a Pisces logo. There's 2 fish. The myth is that Venus and her son, I want to say it's Eros, I might be wrong on that, but Venus and Eros are mother and son, and they're being chased, and they are tied to, by a, they're about to run into the ocean, and she's like, let me tie your foot to mine so that if we get lost we can find each other. And we see this tethering on surfboards and paddle boards and stuff like that, right? I mean, we see them in the earthly world. So they jump into the ocean, and mom goes to heaven or the sky or the universe, whatever you call it, and the child stays here. So this is the first separation of, I don't belong here, I am different, I don't feel right, my first snow globe crack, some part of me is missing. Where you have Neptune in the chart, there is a void internally. You don't know how to fill it. So you fill it with food, you fill it with money, you fill it with sex, you fill it with magazines, you fill it with clothing. So it is a void that you feel. And this is a notorious Piscean thing, specifically Sun in Pisces. Not that Neptune, moons in Pisces don't have this, but a Pisces Sun will tell you that there is an emptiness, a void, a hole in the pit of their stomach. These words are how we describe our existence. We don't know how to fill it. So it's a very common sign, and of course, wherever you have this, but specifically with the Pisces Sun, that you want to fill it with something. So this creates a deadly sin of gluttony. And Neptune in your chart, you have gluttony. Now, again, physical, emotional, mental. I don't care what you eat. I don't care who you sleep with. I don't care how many shoes you have. You have a gluttonous thought problem in that part of your chart. And so worthlessness is here. I'm so worthless, I need to have so many shoes. I'm so worthless, I need to eat. I'm so worthless, I have to buy. I'm so worthless, I have to XYZ. Wherever you have Neptune, there is a worthlessness issue. Remember, a face is thrown to the bottom of the ocean. He's trying to get back on top. The irony of this archetype is that hidden behind that low level worthlessness, I am a pauper. What I really know is I'm a prince, and I'm hiding my narcissistic tendencies, this is a very narcissistic sign and planet, hence the covertness and manipulation of it, not the overtness of the fire or the Mars or the sun, that it is through the worthlessness and the emotion, and I'm so not, that I manipulate and actually get back to Olympus. That's why the myths are so important. So you could see how you're weaving this in your life. Okay. But this feeling of emptiness, of existential angst, that is a Pisces construct. So everybody has Pisces, everybody has Neptune. Obviously, people with 5 placements in Pisces are going to be like, you know, confused. So the mother jumps into the heavens and the child stays on earth. And so when you go to all or none thinking, when you go to wanting a savior, when you want to rescue, when you are a victim, the things that plague us in the earthly world, because Neptune rules this domain, what it is I am seeking that connection from the divine that I confuse as my mother. Your mother has nothing to do with it. She was a vessel. Moon and Pisces enter. You confuse mother and divine. That idea. That's why that's the hardest one. What you're seeking is the transcendent. That's why it's the divine feminine. It's not mom. It is the universal womb of which you came from. So that exists, and you're here, and you're bound by you're tethered by this string. You see it there between the 2 fish, and you don't have a freaking clue. So what do? You go 1 0 to the string, 100 to the string, 0 to the string, 100 to the string. I eat, I don't eat. I have sex, I don't have sex. I smoke, I don't smoke. This doesn't go away, even though we're in the energetic age of Aquarius, by the way. This is the archetype of Neptune. He got the oceans. This is ocean. We're 80% water. This is the archetype. This does not go away. And everybody has heard me say that more than once. That's why. So all of this content in your chart is in your Neptune and any Pisces placement, any Pisces cusp, and any Pisces decanat. That's a lot of work. So that's a sort of manifestation. And the antidote, if you will, is the chalice. Being fully grounded in the body with a spiritual practice, a connection to your divine, a connection to that void, you filling it yourself with your self-worth, setting boundaries from Saturn, knowing what you're worth, saying no, and all the things that we read about Neptune people can't do. Any questions, doubts, screams? Okay, and there's so much more, but I will stop for now.
I just have to say that there's like a hawk that's been visiting starting yesterday, and he's here at the pond. I have a bunch of water right here, and there's like falcon hawk visiting. So I don't know what significance that has, but it feels like there's some.
Well, naturally, the 8th house is, the hawk is the 8th house, right? The falcon hawk is the 8th house of death. The natural placement of the 8th is Scorpio, and one of the decanats of Scorpio is Pisces, is Neptune. So that could be one manifestation. You can also look at your chart. You can also look at what's transiting your 8th and Neptune and in your personal space, since it's entered your space, what it's inviting you. So what Pluto enters and invites to die, Neptune invites you to dissolve, and I'm talking in a transit, but the antidote is Saturn. So you can look at the chart with Neptune and see what you have to put a boundary on, or where you're too limited and restricted, and Neptune is coming to kill that in the sense that it needs to dissolve a bit. So you could see how difficult the archetype is to navigate, because If you're too much into the transcendent function, then you've checked out of the earthly world, right? You're dissociated. You want, you know, rainbows and unicorns and no reality. Well, you can't do that. You got to be here now, present in the chalice. So if you're in the body and you're so just dissatisfied with life, your life is worthless, you have this void, you don't understand that your emotions are dictating everything, you miss your mom, whatever your earthly language is, and that you need Saturn, you need some boundaries around that, and you need a relationship with something higher than yourself, it gets very difficult to work on this aspect. It has to be almost in isolation. And that's why you see Neptunian places are isolated, not only bottom of the ocean, but mental hospital, an ashram, a monastery where I can work on this. And retreats are ruled by this, right? So you go, you work through something on a retreat, and then you go home, and I assume you keep working on it. But those concentrated sort of, I have to get here and I've got to figure this out, is very Neptunian, but it works with Saturn. But check out your Neptune and your eighth and stuff like that. So let's go through the houses, and then I'll do your charts. So the first house, there's an ego loss to find yourself. That is going to be sort of how your deluge myth lives out. So a full undoing, a full unraveling. That's what happened to me. Like, I lost all of it. And I didn't care about losing my hair and my husband and my house. I cared about losing my faith, because the faith I had was a blind faith. It was a non-foundational, good root faith. And that had to be reestablished. So that sort of undoing in that space. So like a Neptune in the eighth with money. If that's your God, if that's your faith, then it makes sense. Not that you won't get it back. It's not about not getting it back. I got mine back stronger. But now you're Jonah. Now you understood that you had to break down in order to rebuild, to strengthen the roots. There's confusion, it's lack of clarity, it's manipulation, it's passive aggressive, you have no boundary. I was obviously born into a cult. You have that facility to be swayed by these type of things because there's no boundary between you and another. Mental health problems, because it's the first house that reflects on health, even though the sixth is health. The second house, low self-worth. People that have Neptune in the second house do not know how to manage their money. Now, you might have a Neptune in Capricorn that knows how to manage their money and maybe makes a lot of money. You also have to see the entirety of the chart. And if they have 10 planets in Earth, obviously there's going to be, but it's a self-worth issue. Remember, physical, emotional, mental, doesn't matter. Tell me what's going on in the transcendent function. I am worthless. Doesn't matter if I have a lot or I have a little. It's that underlying inner instability of confusion that I am worthless. In the third, it's very artistic. They have a very imaginative mind. They're very good psychic. Not like a psychic in the 12th or a psychic in the 8th that is very like, but they can maybe see vision. They can be very clairvoyant. Maybe their artwork or their imagination or their pictures are like prophetic. This is someone who's going to probably have a lot of difficulty concentrating. So school K through 12 issues will abound here. They daydream, they can't concentrate. Neptune in the fourth, because your fourth not only is your physical home, it's your third chakra, it's your inner home. These people struggle with worth issues as well, similar to the second. It may not be through a money exchange, but it could be through a familial exchange. Usually it's a spiritual home, or can be a spiritual home, or an addiction home. There's usually a strong connection to one of the parents spiritually, energetically, things like that with that Neptune. They might want to live, if we're thinking about our physical home, by the sea, by the ocean, by a body of water. There's a lot of idealism in the person's psyche. If it's Neptune idealism, which inevitably is going to be shattered because you can't sustain the idealism. And then it's another self-worth issue because it's the fourth house of the parents. So my parents idealize me, then they don't, then they do, then they don't. And they're in this, you know, tug of war. In the fifth, Neptune in the fifth, you can have a very dramatic child. Obviously, you can have a Pisces child. You can have a child with a Piscean personality, a Piscean creative pursuits, because Pisces is very creative. It's all imagination and arts and things like that. The person could be a prodigy. Your kid could be an artistic prodigy. So have like some special, you know, gift. And the person with Neptune in the fifth may tend to sacrifice, overly sacrifice, like those parents that are sacrificial for their children and for lovers. It's a very codependent placement, the Neptune in the fifth, just like seventh, although seventh has a different twist. The sixth house is someone who might be a nurse, someone who might be in a service oriented type of or medical field or mental health field. Their day-to-day work life or their structure at home, because it's the day-to-day routine. Neptune isn't a routine planet. You're in a labyrinth, so there's no routine. Maybe your routine is being in the labyrinth, but it's not what a outsider would call being organized and routine focused or structured. And it could be someone that on a daily basis goes into the abyss, the labyrinth of it, and then comes out. And that's like their ritual. That's their day-to-day practice. They need peace at work. As nebulous and as confusing as Neptune is, it's actually, if you go to the god, if you go to Poseidon, Poseidon rarely came out of the ocean. He was not a god that was seen a lot. Even Hephaestus, he was down there all the time. So where you have Neptune, you tend to have a hermit type quality. And because there isn't a Saturnian control with boundaries and structure, but your space, your confusion, your chaos is your sort of silence and refuge. So if it's in the sixth house of work, they need that sort of refuge in that space. And at work, home too, that could be they need maybe to have a man cave or something like that. The seventh. So Neptune in the seventh idealizes the partner. That's one. So when I tell you a person says my marriage is a Hallmark movie, they believe it. The person could be cheating. The person can be robbing them blind. The person could be coming home drunk every night. All of those are Neptune in the seventh, but they don't see that. You see what you want to see. You see the truth that you want to believe. Another thing with Neptune in the seventh is these are people that oftentimes are continuously waiting for the next better person. I'll marry them, but no, there's going to be someone better. Grass is greener, someone better, someone better. And they're constantly waiting for the ideal, the better, the unicorn, and it never comes. So that's not uncommon. Neptune in the seventh can be someone also that their relationship sexually could be platonic, like their marriage. They're more like a brother sister, because Hephaestus marries Aphrodite, but Aphrodite has sex with Ares. So you can have a mistress. I'm not going to classify this as polyamory, that there are multiples, because that's a different archetype, but it could be that, oh, we're a sexless marriage, so go and have an open marriage. That could be a construct in that Neptune in the seventh. There will be other things that confirm that, but you can see that the myth of Hephaestus and Aphrodite, they don't have intercourse. She has a lover, which is Ares. So the relationship can be more of a platonic brother-sister marriage rather than a sexual relationship. In the eighth, psychic. Neptune in the eighth is one of the most psychic planet placements in the entire chart. And I'm not talking, Uranus in the 8th, flash of intuition. I'm talking about psychic depths of the subconscious psychic, like the 12th. The 8th is actually, the 4th and the 8th are actually more psychic than the 12th, not because they're more psychic, but because they believe it, they encourage it. People with Neptune in the 12th are more like, I had a dream, it's prophetic, I don't really believe because I don't really know. They can't get in touch with that part of themselves that they don't have a framework. Imagine it's a Neptune in a Neptune house. There's no framework. Whereas in the 8th, you have more of a scorpionic framework. Wait, there's some control about how psychic, I'm going to go take a class and learn about this. And in the 4th, it's more about a claircognizance. I know, I trust this. I see this related in my life. Neptune in the 12th being supremely psychic, oftentimes the only way that the function can come out is through this dream state. Neptune in the 8th can have financial ruin, because if we're talking about dissolution of ego, and if money or sex or money from a sexual partner is the definition of worth, and I have to lose it all so that I can strengthen my tree trunk and I can deepen my roots and I can seek my true transcendent function with the universe, I have to lose it all to get it back. Neptune in the 8th can be that. And of course, if anything that Neptune touches makes it nebulous, makes it cloudy, you can't see that the guy in the next desk next to you is robbing you blind because you have Neptune in the 8th and that's your financial business partner. These people also Neptune in the 8th, and like in this chart, Cameron has all that Pisces. This is also valuable. These are people that tend to have a very healing touch upon death. So like being a death doula or helping people cross over. If it's not necessarily touch, they can connect to in terms of those that have crossed over or have died. They tend to have that. It's very, very important that Pisces or Neptune in the 8th be very, very clear on their taxes, because Neptune makes everything nebulous. You're not clear on your taxes, and Neptune loves 12th house themes. You're going to jail for tax evasion or lack of clarity on your taxes. So you start to see the story unfold, and then later on in other levels, we'll connect to Neptune and then the 12th house and then the cusp and the whole story and how it unfolds, but you need to have this foundation to know. Neptune in the 9th is an idealism. It's a seeker archetype, philosophy, all these themes. The problem with Neptune in the 9th is they're fanatics. There isn't a boundary around the philosophy. There isn't a boundary around the teacher. There isn't a boundary around the travel. There isn't a boundary around the books, the expansion and the expansion and the expansion that they know nothing. So I had a client text me this morning, and he read another guy who says, you don't create everything, and he wants my viewpoint. And I said, my viewpoint doesn't matter. What do you think? He has this, that's what I'm saying. His Neptune in the 9th. And I said, you need to create your theory that works for you. I know mine. What do you want? What's your rules around your philosophy? Neptune in the 9th, they're so consumed with everything that enters and they want it all. And remember, gluttonous thinking, that they do nothing or know nothing or apply nothing. Neptune in the 10th can be an idealism in a profession. It could also be someone who's like in the nursing profession, obviously a priest or a nun or some sort of profession linked to spirituality or religion. And Neptune in the 10th, more so than Neptune in the 4th, could feel as if they were rejected from their parents, mainly mom, because the 10th house is more mom than dad, really. And because Hera rejected Hephaestus, you can see that the person feels rejected. So maybe they excel at work. If it's all or none thinking, if it's gluttonous thinking in a profession, they're workaholics. Not that Pisces are workaholics, that's not it at all. But if you have to take the addiction and put it in that house and make it work for your psyche, then all I'm going to do is work and prove my worth to my mother through, like Hephaestus is making all these jewelry, through this professional experience. So you start to frame the client's story and how they made it work for them through the planetary archetype placements. Neptune in the 11th. So the 11th is a confusing house because it's groups and it's isms, and it kind of by design is a gluttonous house. So if you have a Neptune in there, it may be very difficult perhaps to identify a specific set of friends, or you only have a religious group of friends or a spiritual group of friends, and maybe you section them off for these different functions, but somehow you're the one that's woven with all of them. You can have friends that will drag you into drugs, into different, sort of addicting or poor coping experiences. Neptune in the 11th, you'll definitely attract unusual friends, very spiritual or psychic or Piscean type friends. You may be the victim of the group, or you may be the savior of the group or the rescuer of the group. It depends on how you play out the archetype. You have that archetype wherever you have Neptune: victim, savior, rescuer, consistently. You might have addict friends. You may have, it's different than the 12th, but you might have friend groups where there are enemies, like frenemies. That would be a frenemies. Very different than the 12th. And the 12th, absolutely intuitive, absolutely psychic, more dreams and prophecy, but maybe not even believing the gifts. And this is a person who feels lonely and in bondage. The Neptune placements that are Earth houses, for instance, the 6, they feel bonded by the body, bonded by the structure of the day-to-day routine. That's going to be a struggle. If the bottom of the ocean is here, and yeah, okay, Neptune, if it's Poseidon hangs on the bottom of the ocean, but I'm stuck in the middle Earth because the water is what makes this world different than that world, then I feel in bondage to, or I'm stuck in bondage to this. The concept I said about immortality earlier that we see in Gilgamesh and that we see in some of these myths is that immortality is a Neptunian function. And the only thing to limit the immortality is the Saturnian function, which is the body, that karma. So it's when we start to get along with Neptune and Saturn, or boundaries on our ego, or a structure in our day-to-day, wherever you have Neptune, that you could start to live the myth, where the chalice doesn't feel like a bondage, the body is no longer a bondage, but rather houses the need for desire, but is limited. So the bondage feeling eliminates. If you have somebody who's uber structured, a lot of earth, or their tendency is to be very structured, look at their Neptune. Their Neptune is where they're slipping through the crack. They're going underneath. They're creating that chaos somewhere. Really fine. Think of like how the water just goes through the membrane of the cell. That's the way it is. Some people have like this, Cameron has all this water like me, like we're here, you see it in us. But I'm talking about more of the person that hides it or appears to be very earth, that Neptune seeping through will be seen. Neptune in the 12th, 100%, that person will have friends that will betray them and backstab them. That is, I don't know who my enemies are. In the 11th, you know that they're frenemies. They're in the group, you stay away, you're not close. In the 12th, it's total blindsided. You don't know. You're like shocked that this is a person that is your enemy and poisoning you. Neptune in the 12th is the addict placement. It's also people that are institutionalized, nuns, wanting to hide out, recluse in society under a spiritual umbrella. Any questions? Okay, let me just make sure I covered everything. I mentioned the feet. Pisces rules the feet because the Pisces is the most ungrounded sign. Wherever you have Neptune or Pisces, you're not grounded. Hence why you could be psychic there, right? So when we talk about tarot, the tarot journey is called the Fool's Journey. The first card is the Fool in most decks. It's an ungrounded, I'm not, usually the Fool's card is either on a very unstable territory or about to fall off a cliff or something. And then the unfolding of the storyline of the cards, which is your journey or your chart, to get you back to the 12th, to get you back to self, back to the ordinary world, where you're here in the illusory world and in on it. Now you're grounded in your reality. Forget reality, your reality, who you are. So when people have feet issues, it's a Neptune thing. That's why a lot of people do pilgrimages. They walk at Santiago de Compostela. The feet have to hurt. They get to a pilgrimage and they get off their feet, they kneel. It's this reverence to this something else, but I have to be rooted in reality in order to get to that. I can't be floating in midair. This is also the archetype of the innocent. The innocent archetype is the sheep, and hence Jesus is the shepherd thou shalt not want, right? So where you have Neptune, you want a shepherd, you want to be saved, you want to be rescued, and you will attract the shepherd in until you become your own shepherd. So on the dark side of this, and innocents don't necessarily know that they're innocents, or know that they're wolves in sheep's clothing. You will also have the wolf in sheep's clothing here, that sleight of hand where you have Neptune. Signs, aspects are going to determine that more specifically in a person's chart. And I think that is all I have before we go to the, so I just want to make sure. So, no, before. Okay. So Cameron, obviously we talked about. So he's got the 6th house, Neptune, but look at all of this stellium over the 8th and the 9th. So that's going to be a big area of not only the capacity for spirituality and the transcendent function, which are 8th and 9th house, areas, but all of the unraveling and undoing and so forth. Who else? Nicole. Where do you have Neptune, Nicole? I feel like I know your chart already.
I
And
have
third. Okay.
Neptune in the 3rd and then the Pisces moon in the 6th.
Okay. Yeah, I remembered your moon. So that makes sense for what you do in terms of plant medicine and stuff like that, right? I mean, you're grounded in the medicine and seeking the transcendence through the 6th house. Remember, the 6th house is Virgo. The 6th house is Mother Earth, Terra, matter, like materia prima. So you're doing that when you're in the earth, when you go on your camping, when you do those earthly things, and then you're connecting there. So you're using that appropriately for work life and balance there. Neptune in the 3rd, were you unorganized at school? Were you lack of concentration at school, in lower school, K through 12 school?
I was actually identified as a gifted child and taken out of ordinary classes once a week to like go do the things that were sort of separate.
Okay,
but
so
I was
separate,
very isolated.
special,
I was very
gifted.
isolated.
Hear the language?
Yeah. Yep. I was very isolated. I love to just be by myself and read my books and like, yeah.
So we start to see the language that we speak, and then it's like, oh, there it is. Yeah. I was just seeing if you have any. Okay. No, I was looking to see if you had any negative aspects to it, but no. Sharon, where do you have yours?
But I am curious about third house is also communication, right?
Yes, so third house communication, great question. Third house Neptune can be very nebulous in its communication. So for any of you who ever worked with me, I'll be like, tell me the conflict in one sentence. That's why. The conflict in one sentence eliminates the nebulousness. So if you were to write an email or send a text, for instance, it might be this big. All emotion, all labyrinth, all mired in nonsense. And then one key thing that the reader that you're communicating to or the person has to decipher in there. So you see the emotion, you see the labyrinth, you see, that's why tell me the conflict in one sentence is a question I ask clients, because we're dealing with a Neptune-Mars relationship, a Hephaestus-Aries relationship. He stole his wife. That's the conflict. But there's this 20-hour story about why he was able to steal the wife, and we want to get in the story. So wherever you have the Neptune, you're going to do that. So if it's in the communication, the story is part of the connection, is part of the humanness, it's part of the emotional manipulation. That's a biggie.
Yeah.
Oh, Neptune in the 11th. Okay. So you can have some bad
misspoke
influence
earlier.
of friends or some real spiritual friends. But look, something that's happening next week, she's going to the beach. She does this yearly beach thing with friends. So seaside, I mean, that's at a mundane level. I'm just saying there's so much that this touches. So friends that live by the sea or friends that are spiritual in nature, you know, she's in these classes of spirituality. It could be a church group. It could be a friend that's a Pisces. It could be bad influence friends that, you know, do drugs and alcohol and stuff like that. And you have to watch out. That was probably more at a younger age, but you see and then there's a lack of boundaries sometimes with friends. So watching boundaries or setting parameters on groups. If it's a very gluttonous planet and I want all groups all the time, that could be an area that some boundaries have to be placed. Jen, look at this. I don't know anybody's Neptune, which is so funny. That's how nebulous is that it's you know, eluded me. There it is. Okay. So this is a really interesting placement, just from a mythological space, Neptune, Mars. So that Hephaestus, Aries mythology somewhere is living out in your life. Now, it does not have to be marriage, but the archetype of the overt covert of the transaction of I'll give you this for this, the necklace, manipulate through, you see it woven in there. That's a really powerful placement. And then you've got Neptune, Venus. So now you're to the mother in the sky and the kid stuck in the ocean. So she has a lot of mythological sort of placements here that the story can play out. And look how interesting. Here's Mars and here's Venus, and Hephaestus got between them. So it doesn't mean that you're living that out literally, but somewhere in the 11th house in that group. And look, you have the same as your mom. So there's a generational placement there too. That's a really interesting, in terms of the myth, when you start to find the connection of the myth with the archetypes on your chart, and you're like, oh, I play that myth out by sign and by house. That's not a marriage house, but it plays out in other areas. That's a neat one. And did I miss anyone, Jen?
Can you do Abby? I know she'll watch the recording.
I think hers is in the first. Yeah. Okay. She's in the first. This is an interesting. I too have Black Moon Neptune, but mine are conjunct. Another thing with Neptune, when Neptune is touching another planet, I'll show 2 charts on that. I'll get back to that. But when Neptune is watching an conjunct another planet, really conjunct, like your Venus or your Mars, it drowns it. Okay. So the ruler of the chart is the black moon. Like, this is a very psychic chart. Like, you cannot have a first house with black moon, Neptune, and Uranus and not be like, whether you're practicing or not or aware of it, and not be psychic. Like, these are very intuitive psychic placements in the first. It's got to be, you know. So that's the one thing, drawn to esoteric topics, things like that. But when you're looking at a chart, let the chart tell the story. So if this is birth, right off of birth, there had to be some conflict. There had to be some drama, black moon rules, maybe an ending of a cycle, maybe a move, maybe something happens, it ends, and then Neptune shows up. So if you're looking at the South Node as an ending, something from the past, and right after that, Neptune, confusion, and you'll know, you're her mother, you know the story, I don't know the story. But let's just use an example. We move, we close the door in Scotland, and now we move here, and this is confusion territory, right? Neptune. And then Uranus, some chaotic event. That person is going to repeat that pattern again and again and again and again. This Neptune isn't going to happen without something ending, without a door closing, without some karmic past happening. The confusion sets in, and then some chaos or unraveling or intuition. And then, so you start to see how just the visual nature of the chart starts to tell you where, and it's for all archetypes. I'm just using hers as an example because it's an interesting placement. This first house is very interesting. It's like having 3 lives in one. So she's not going to have a continuous story. It's going to be boom, boom, boom. Once I get through the 3 sort of strikes of the drum, then I can live a normal life. And then again, boom, boom, boom. So you start to see how the story unfolds visually in the chart. That's a very interesting placement. And then, of course, everything I said about the first. But let me show you. I'll just use mine because I know that I have that conjunction. So Neptune is the ruler of my chart, and it's touching the ascendant. And I've told you that the ascendant is birth. Minutes. The day after my birth, my story, I was the only kid to cross the ocean to get to the cult leader. Like, that's a blatant ocean cult leader. Boom, lived it. So that, like Abby, that boom, boom, boom she has, I'm going to have it clustered. And that cluster has to live out together. So anything Neptune is next to, and this is a conjunction. Abby's not conjunction because they're 2 separate. This is a 3-degree conjunction. Neptune, you get 5. It drowns. It does the deluge. It does the Jonah myth. It swallows you. It's a gluttonous thing. It has to all encompass the other planet that's attached to it. So Jen, you have that on both sides. It's got to swallow the Mars. It's got to swallow the Venus. And then all you see is the Neptune. So moving away the Neptune so that the Mars and the Venus can live and coexist is part of the struggle. When Neptune is like plastering onto, and that's just a conjunction. We haven't talked about squares and oppositions. That's next level. But visually, if someone has a Neptune with another planet, that planet is lost. There's no, it's dissolved, like you don't even know what it is. I have someone who has it Neptune sun. So that's like being a Pisces. There's no boundary with the sun integrity. So you start to see that. Okay, any questions?
Can you stop the recording for a second and we can just do a quick,
Yeah, but no questions for class.
oh, no questions.
Okay.